Hello, this is Kellyanne from the Common Surface. Before we get started on today's broadcast with Dr. Farrell, I just wanted to give you guys a note about the audio quality on this particular recording. Dr. Farrell and I had to resort to using the telephone in order to be able to make this broadcast happen. So the audio quality is not quite as good. It sounds a little bit like those old tapes that the beautiful and brilliant Georgianne Hughes recorded with Dr. Farrell, because in fact he's using the same telephone that he used during those broadcasts. So I think nostalgically you may enjoy that. But also, I just wanted to also say this is about 2 hours and 50 minutes of the deepest dive into the origins of the West and the errors that were made, both vertent and inadvertent, in its formation, which really explains a lot of the reasons we are where we are today. Thank you so much.
This is Kelly M., and you're on the Common Surface, and we are blessed to have Dr. Joseph P. Farrell with us once again. Dr. Farrell has a degree in early church history, a subject called patristics, from the University of Oxford. He's the author of probably 40 books on the state of the world and how it got here, strange stuff, and alternative history and science. And so Dr. Farrell's on the line. Say hello, Joseph.
Howdy, howdy.
Yeah. So we were talking a little while ago, and I wanted to get into the present moment. Like, we live in a world that every one of us acknowledges has more or less gone insane. A confusing, dissonant, conflict-driven world, fractured on any number of different levels, and I, having read your book, God, History, and Dialectic, I understand, to a degree, how we got here, and so I wanted to talk about the thesis in that book from the point of view of getting to people to understand, where we went wrong. I mean, basically, that's what it comes down to. And so before we do that, I wanted to know if you would talk for a few minutes about what were the origins of that book. On your biography, that's actually on the website, it's actually not listed as one of your books. And so, yeah.
Well, it's listed, but I haven't kept up with that tab on my website, and I should, but it does appear on the website with all the other books.
And if you go to go ahead. If you go to Amazon and try to buy this book, even digital editions are going for $60 to $80. Is this still in print?
It is in print at Lulu. I do not advise going to Amazon, because Amazon will send you to sellers that are selling you used copies and marking up the price. Go directly to Lulu and look for the book. It's actually 4 books. It's 4 volumes to that study. It's called God, History, and Dialectic, and then you can also go to the website directly and look at all the tabs of the books, and that particular series is also on my website.
Right.
But originally, you're asking how the book came about. the book is really a set of transcribed lecture notes. In the days I was college teaching, I did a number of courses in medieval philosophy and classical philosophy and so on, and a number of courses in European history, including medieval history. And I had built up kind of a student following at that as a result of doing those courses, and they could all tell that I was kind of holding back something in the way I presented material in those courses. And at that time, this was back in the early 90s, my father had a stroke, and as a result of that, I decided that I should quit teaching and move closer to help my mother take care of him. So that's what I did, and I decided as a result of that to request the head of the classics department at the University of Oklahoma to allow me to do a course that would let all these students kind of see what I was never saying. So the course was called God, History, and Dialectic, and the books that resulted from it, I had about, I'd estimate 30 to 40 students in that class that started out. The books that resulted from that class were basically the students at the end of that class, there were maybe 10 to 12, insisted that I write up all the recorded lectures that I had done in that class. So what the books are is essentially a kind of heavily edited transcript of some of the lectures from that original course. In particular, the opening prolegomena to all 4 volumes, that is more or less a transcript of the opening lecture to that course. So the books were done primarily on the insistence of some students that wanted hard copies. So after the course was done, I spent about 2 to 4 weeks. I don't remember how long it was. I think it was basically a month of feverishly trying to edit cassette recordings and notes that I had made and create a book out of it, and that in turn I photocopied at Kinko's and had it bound into these just basically self-produced, self-published little books to sell to these students that wanted copies of it, which that happened. And the next thing I know is that these students apparently had been photocopying this thing and handing it all. It became kind of a samizdat underground thing. So the next thing I know is about 2 years down the line, I'm getting calls and requests from people I've never heard of to, where do I get copies of this book? And so what that convinced me of is to try and make the book a regular book. So I tried to do that. There were many copies of it that were done by some people that just had no clue as to how I wanted things to be formatted and so on and so forth. They absolutely gutted my original analytical table of contents. So as a result of all of that, I decided, okay, enough is enough. I've got to take this thing and put it into some sort of shape. So the Lulu books that resulted now are basically the original Samizdat Kinko's copies. They've been edited a bit, but not too much. There are still some errors in it. You can never edit sufficiently when you're trying to correct or catch your own mistakes. You got to have somebody do it, but I don't have a staff, and I don't have the money to pay anybody to do it anyway. But the 4 books now that are out there are, as far as I'm concerned, canonical. I do not advise anyone to buy any online version, because, as I said, they changed the formatting and everything, and you're going to miss the point. So the Lulu books are the canonical versions of that series.
So
Hello?
so the basic I just was on mute. So the basic concept of the book is what?
Well, the basic concept is that people do not understand why we have an Eastern and a Western Europe, and this is fundamental to the elaboration of our civilization. And they don't understand this because, particularly in America, the idea that actual theological concepts or doctrines would lie at the root of their civilization is just not something that people either want to think about or even hear. They don't want to deal with it. But this is essentially what the book argues. The book is arguing, if you boil it right down to maybe two major themes, the themes would be, first of all, that the civilizational crisis that we're in is a crisis of our understanding or doctrine of God, number one. Number two, that understanding is not about a God in general. It is about the Christian Trinity. And the Western half of that civilizational equation basically went off the rails because it could not deal with an ultimate plurality in God by any other means than by a kind of binary moral dialectical opposition. In other words, it cannot conceive of a multiplicity of goods in the good. It must always deal with multiplicity in some sort of binary moral oppositional fashion. As a result of that, in turn, you have a reduction of essential categories in God to a series of mutual equivalencies. The classic example from Western history would be the reduction of God's foreknowledge to mean the same thing as his predestination. So in other words, once you say that the one equals the other, then all the other attributes of God become equivalent to each other. They become identical. And when you really look at that process, when you start saying A equals B and B equals C, ergo A equals C in God, what you've done is you've reduced God to a syllogism, number one. But the other much more sinister thing is you become incapable of maintaining categorical universal distinctions in God. So in other words, you've set up the nominalist-realist debate, and you've decided to come down on the side of nominalism by maintaining these things are not real, they're all equivalent to each other. And when you say they're all equivalent to each other, what else have you done? You've set up nihilism. So in other words, these changes were extremely crucial to the development of our civilization. And they as a result of some assumptions that were made along the way, as a result of that, these things lead to a breakdown in society itself. You're no longer capable of maintaining distinctions without oppositions. Let me give you an example that may help. And I'm going to read something here from the Anti-Federalist Papers, okay?
Okay.
And I want people to listen very carefully, because if you listen to this passage, what you're really hearing is a formulation of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as it was formulated and as the formulation came to be accepted in and by the western half of Europe. Follow me?
Yeah.
Now, this means that the eastern half of Europe did not buy into this formulation and therefore did not walk down this path. So this is the Anti-Federalist Paper Sentinel number 1, okay? This is both political science and theology rolled all into one. And here goes the quotation, quote, Mr. Adams, meaning John Adams, sine qua non of good government is 3 balancing powers whose repelling qualities are to produce an equilibrium of interests and thereby promote the happiness of the whole community. He asserts that the administrators of every government will ever be actuated by views of private interest and ambition to the prejudice of the public good. That, therefore, the only effectual method to secure the rights of the people and promote their welfare is to create an opposition of interests between the members of two distinct bodies in the exercises of the powers of government, and balanced by those of a third. This hypothesis supposes human wisdom competent to the task of instituting three co-equal orders in government and a corresponding weight in the community to enable them respectively to exercise their several parts, and whose views and interests should be so distinct as to prevent a coalition of any two of them for the destruction of the third.
Wow.
Mr. Adams, although he has traced the constitution of every form of government that has ever existed, as far as history affords materials, has not been able to adduce a single instance of such a government, unquote.
Wow.
Now, if you know, and I know that you know, but if you know the formulation of the Western doctrine of the Trinity as Saint Augustine of Hippo Regius formulated it, and that formulation eventually became the formulation accepted by most of the Western Church. It was not and is not accepted to this day by the churches of the East, be they Eastern Orthodox or Coptic or Nestorian or what have you. So, in other words, the two Europes are disagreed over their doctrine of God. And how much more fundamental can you get? Now, the reason that passage is so interesting is that most people are familiar with that little diagram from Sunday school where you have a triangle. If you draw three circles, imagine in your head you're drawing three circles, two at the top, one at the bottom. And each of these three circles represents one of the persons of the Trinity, Father and the Son in the top two circles and Holy Spirit in the bottom, okay? And then between these three circles, you're going to draw three lines. And in the lines themselves, you're going to put the words non est in Latin, or is not. So in other words, what the diagram is supposed to be is a diagram of the doctrine of the Trinity. And notice how you're defining the persons in that diagram. You're defining them by their opposition to the other two persons. So in other words, you are never really thinking in terms of a 1-3. You're thinking in terms of a 1-2. Okay? It's always
like
one person.
Like a 1-2 twice.
Yeah, exactly. You're always defining persons first of all in terms of their mutual opposition. Okay?
By what
so
they're
in other
not.
words, on what they're not. Right. So in other words, you are reducing personhood itself to a series of relations of opposition. And secondly, more importantly, you're reducing distinction itself to a relation of opposition. So in other words, you're setting up a whole binary way of thinking within the culture of the West.
And conflict.
And conflict. You are setting up a perpetual subliminal cultural predisposition to think of every opposition, of every distinction as opposition. And incidentally, when I said that, distinction as opposition, I'm quoting the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus. So in other words, that's another clue, is that you are literally forcing theology into a philosophical mold that is incapable of comprehending the theological fullness. And
Right.
you are reducing distinction to a series of binary oppositions. Well, once this enters the culture, look what happens. You can literally view the Protestant Reformation as nothing but a series of these oppositions. Predestination versus free will, faith versus works, scripture versus tradition, and on we go. And
Right.
once you set that up, then you can have secular versions of it as well, hard hard disciplines versus soft disciplines, and so on and so forth. On and on this goes. So the fundamental point I'm trying to make here is that when you introduce this way of thinking into the very doctrine of God itself, it's bound to show up in other aspects of the culture, like it or not. And from the quotation I just read you can take Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in that diagram and simply replace it with legislative, executive, and judicial.
Yeah.
And voila, you've got the American so-called constitutional system, which really turns out to be nothing but an attempt to take that doctrine and squeeze it into political science and create something that's supposed to work as a government. Well, it only works as a government by means of creating those oppositions and keeping everyone divided. Hint, 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 in other words. The Anti-Federalists were calling it out early on and pointing out that this system is going to break down because it cannot deal with three co-equal branches of government. One branch is always going to be inferior to the other two, and so on, ad infinitum. So, the whole point I'm trying to make here is you cannot understand and will not understand the current cultural dilemma of the West without understanding that it is, like it or not, it is theologically, ultimately, in nature. And it's not going to get any better until that fact is dealt with and accepted. And once it's dealt with and accepted, then you have to penetrate to the roots of, well, what actually set up this mess? It cannot be addressed simply by dismissing it, because the attempts to dismiss it really, I think, is what we're dealing with now. The more you try and dismiss it, the harder it comes back, and the more it demands that you pay attention to it.
Right, and it comes back in a powerful and a warped way at the same time.
Yes, absolutely. Because,
yeah.
and again, this is important to understand. The formulation of the doctrine itself is already warped. It's already twisted.
Right.
Let me give you another example of it. The Western doctrine of the atonement is basically the way that most people tend to think of it is something that was formulated by a fellow by the name of Anselm of Canterbury right around the time, in fact, that the Eastern and Western churches split from each other. And Anselm wrote a treatise called the Cur Deus Homo. That's the Latin title. Literally, it means Why the God-Man. And at the very beginning of this treatise, and I'm going to quote him as closely as I can from memory here, but I think people will immediately latch on to what the significance is. In the very beginning of this treatise, he says, quote, "In fine, leaving Christ altogether out of the picture as if nothing had ever been known of him, we shall seek to prove by absolute reasons why it was altogether necessary for God to become man," unquote. That's his method. And when you look at what he does, basically what he does is he sets up the idea that mankind owes God an infinite debt because by sinning he's offended the infinite justice of God. And that justice, being infinite, can never be satisfied by a finite creature. Therefore, God had to become man and satisfy the requirements of divine justice.
Isn't that kind of an accounting trick?
That's an accounting trick, exactly. So in other words, Christ becomes an example of a much wider generalized principle, which you've assumed to be true. Because again, notice the method. As if nothing had ever been known of him. Okay. So where's this coming from? And on and on we could go. So in other words, all of this is related. And as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental problem that gets established with all of this is the reduction of every plurality in God to everything else. And that, of course, once you are incapable of maintaining distinctions that are real, then you're in the world of nominalism, and more importantly, you're in the world of nihilism. So there's a reason why, everyone is wondering, well, how did the West lose its way, and why is it becoming so insane right now? Well, my point is that it's been on this insane path for a very long time. And all that's happening now is that some of the basic cultural fundamental assumptions made long ago are simply working themselves out now to their logical denouement. That's all that's happening.
Right. So we see what happens when the Trinity is broken, if you will, is that people's analogical framework for thinking gets broken.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. And when that, in other words, instead of it being, the Trinity of divine persons of God and the other divine persons are convocal with one another, are all operating on their bases without conflict.
Right.
And go ahead.
Well, what you have in this system is an emphasis on transcendent unity. In other words, as I said before, all distinction is opposition. So opposition itself, as a means of distinguishing between things, becomes the way that you attempt to solve all problems involving distinction. A classic case in the West is the endless, just look at the Western disputes over predestination and free will. We had these disputes in the 4th century. We had them again in the 12th century. We had them in the Protestant Reformation between Luther and Erasmus and between Calvin and Arminius, and on it goes. And every few hundred years they trot out this whole thing and rehash it all, and they never get anywhere because they keep trying to rehash it all on the same basis. Okay?
Right. Right. They're using a broken... It's like a child with a broken toy that keeps trying to get it to do what he wants.
Trying to get it to work, right. And the problem is, how many of us can think of free will without thinking of the ability to sin? My guess is that most of the people listening to this are going to think, oh, well, of course, you can't have free will unless you have the ability to sin. Really? Really? Is every choice that you face really a choice between a moral good and a moral evil? Is going to the grocery store or fixing the radiator in your car today a choice between two morally opposed things? Or is the fundamental condition of free choice a choice between several potential goods? And where then does dialectic enter the picture in terms of a moral dialectic? Well, that's a subset, if you really want to think about it, of possibilities of choice. So in other words, this, I'm throwing a lot of stuff out here, folks, but I'm doing so trying to convince people that the very way that you are thinking is culturally conditioned, and whether you like it or not, it is conditioned by philosophical and theological debates that occurred within this culture centuries ago. And because certain answers or certain ways of formulating the question were accepted as de fide, so to speak, quite literally, and thereby imposed on the West, that the West can't get anywhere until it begins to understand that de fide may not be de fide at all. It may be a departure from de fide. And if that's the case, then we're in a real pickle. We're dealing right now with this war in the Ukraine, between Russia and the Ukraine. And what people have to understand is this is for the Eastern European, this is more assault of the West on their civilization. And it is viewed that way by the Russians. They view this as an existential civilizational threat. They've been through this before. Because what was Bolshevism?
Yeah.
Well, Bolshevism was nothing but the Marxist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic. Well, what's the Hegelian dialectic? Well, crudely put, it's thesis opposed to what? Antithesis, which results in what? Which results in a synthesis, which is in fundamental opposition to the other two.
Right.
So
It's
again,
the Trinity. Aberrant.
it's the Trinity. It's that dialectical Trinity in yet another guise.
Wow.
So look what we have. We've got Hegel in Europe leading to Marx and ultimately the Bolshevik overthrow of Tsarist Russia. And in this country, in the United States, you have what? You have the Constitutional Convention of Philadelphia, which is yet another statement of the very same underlying structure. Okay.
Right.
So, in other words, the West, you're not going to get anywhere, folks, until you really dig down and understand that what's at the heart of this is a formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity, which one half of Europe accepted and the other half of Europe rejected. Okay, that's it. It's that simple. It's that simple.
Right. With your friendly neighborhood banker ready to supply all the conflict needed to make money from both sides.
Exactly. You know.
Yeah.
Where does this whole banking angle enter the picture? Well, here's the bad news, folks. It's a little swampy place called Venice. You know.
Right.
And you know, if you want a long history of malfeasance, skullduggery, and conspiracies, cabals, and plots, check out that place.
Yeah,
they're in the thick of all of this.
Any place of its resting place, you know, is present with mosquitoes. So if you detect the presence.
Look, in Venice, who do you have? You have Gasparo Cardinal Contarini. Okay, now most people never heard of this guy, but Cardinal Contarini, and he was a cardinal. Okay, that's what he was. That was his job. Okay. So Cardinal Contarini is a very typically Venetian fellow, and of course, like all Venetians, his family has one toe deeply embedded in the pool of banking. But Cardinal Contarini is doing what? Well, this is during the period of the Protestant Reformation, and he's exchanging letters with Martin Luther. Now, wait a minute. We have a Roman Catholic cardinal writing friendly letters to the leader of the Protestant Reformation. Oh, and by the way, did I mention that it's the same Gasparo Cardinal Contarini who is sponsoring Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, to get a papal blessing to found the Jesuit order?
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
So here's the other problem. Once you have established that this binary way of thinking is also a means of control, then you've set up the whole controlled opposition framework. And everything that happens in the West must now be done in those terms. And by the way, my quotation of the Sentinel number 1 from the Anti-Federalists was not accidental, and nor is my mention of Cardinal Contarini, because Cardinal Contarini wrote a book, a very interesting book, detailing the actual government and structure of the Venetian Republic. Guess who read that book assiduously?
I have no idea.
Some of the American founding fathers. This is one of their favorite books to read. So in other words, this is all connected, folks, like it or not. Like it or not.
So for example, let's take the Eastern civilization, if you will, and the Eastern civilization didn't make that, that detrimental error, the original sin, right, of Western society. So what does their political framework, theological political framework look like, and how is it different from the West?
Well, it is. That is an excellent question. It's never worked out in detail because I think there's a recognition that any attempt to work it out in detail with every process perfectly spelled out and everything is impossible. The basic idea politically in the East is not even really a political idea. It's a much larger, I would say, kind of politico-cultural idea, and that idea is called Symphonia, symphony. And to give you kind of a picture of how they think, the throne of the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the throne itself was capable of seating two people. And the emperor never sat on that throne with anyone else on it. So in other words, the throne is left empty because it's understood that Christ is the other person sitting on that throne. And the other thing that is absolutely essential to understand in the way that Eastern Europe understood things is that the church itself was a separate entity. So in other words, they did have the idea, and I'm going to use a phrase with the caveat to take it very advisedly. They did have the idea that the church and the state were two separate entities, but that they should rule and govern in a harmonious way. Okay, that was basically the understanding. So there was a role, but it was never spelled out, nor did they attempt to spell it out, because they understood that it would ultimately be impossible. If you contrast this to what's happening more or less from that period of time up to, let's say, the papacy of Gregory VII, of Hildebrand, what you have in the West is an elaboration of a scheme whereby the papacy assumes and claims to have the fullness of not only spiritual power, but the fullness of temporal power. So at the very pinnacle of the West, you have the complete eradication of that separation. And as a result of that eradication, you don't even get the idea of symphony. What you really get is the idea of you either become a feel to the papacy. In other words, you enter into a feudal relationship with the papacy itself, or you are utterly outside the entire feudal system. And of course, ultimately, that claim to authority breaks down with the Protestant Reformation. People just finally have had enough. But you do have two very different cultural outlooks because of that. And incidentally, let me point out that the other thing that we have to bear in mind about this reformulation of Trinitarian thinking in the West is that it is ultimately foisted on the entire Church of the West by an appeal to that very same papal authority. So in other words, accept the one and accept the other. You don't have the one without the other in the Western Church. So this is the other problem. And the third problem is once you get to the point of this formulation where it becomes impossible to distinguish between the plurality of persons in God and the plurality of attributes in God. Please understand what I just said there. Attributes are things like wisdom, justice, holiness, and so on. But those things are not actual persons. But this is exactly the reduction that you see Augustine of Hippo making. So it becomes impossible to distinguish the two. So you have a category confusion in God, as well as a confusion of the three persons themselves.
And the disabling of the operations as well.
And the disabling of the, the whole thing collapses. I mean,
right.
It's breathtaking. And I know that this may sound strange to people who think they understand Augustine or that he would never make such basic errors. The problem is, I point out in God, History, and Dialectic, I cite Augustine, over and over again to show you exactly what's going on and the tendency that his thinking is heading to, because he comes right out and explicitly says these things.
It seems that the Augustine model is more amenable to tyranny.
Oh, absolutely it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely it is. Listen to what one of the things he says here, and we'll get to the tyranny part of this in a minute. He says that as the Father is holy and the Son is holy, and as the Father is Spirit and the Son is Spirit, so the Father and the Son can be called the Holy Spirit, and therefore the whole Trinity can be called the Holy Spirit.
That is
now
ridiculous.
Listen to what well, of course it is. But look what he's done, is he's confused two common attributes of all three persons with one of the three persons. Okay? That's basically what he's done. So in other words, having collapsed the categories, what he's done is he's made a person nothing but a kind of common function of all persons. Now, that may not sound too significant until you translate that whole concept into the doctrine of original guilt.
Oh, yeah.
When Adam and Eve sin, what do? Well, they commit a function of the will, and it's that function of the will of sinning that is transmitted to the wider human nature, so that in that system you end up with a corporate or federal person called Adam. Please note what I just said, a corporate or federal person called Adam, in whom, end quote, all have sinned. And that is exactly the reading of Romans 5:12 in St. Jerome's translation of the Latin Vulgate. That last phrase, which in the King James is for that all have sinned. In the Latin, it's end quote, omnes peccaverunt, in whom all have sinned. So you come into the world guilty of someone else's sin. There's your corporate person.
Wow.
And that's tyranny.
Wow.
That's tyranny. So this is a total system. This is a total system. And it, rightfully, the Eastern churches absolutely rejected it. They told the Pope to take a hike, said, see you later, have your weird doctrine of the Trinity, we want nothing to do with it.
Now, at the same time that all these things are happening, right? When was Hippo alive?
Augustine of Hippo is about 375 or so, up to about the year 430. 430 is when he actually dies. Yeah.
So anywhere between 280 and 450 AD is when a lot of these hijinks were initiated.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
This is the classical period of the elaboration of Trinitarian doctrine within the history of the church. Not that it wasn't going on before that, it was. But the reason that this is the period that is so crucial is because you have people like Hilary of Poitiers or Ambrose of Milan or Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, all these people that you study when you study patristics. You've got all these people in the Greek East and the Latin West on the one hand, and they basically think all more or less the same way. In other words, there's not a peculiarly Greek way of thinking about it, and there's not a peculiarly Latin way of thinking about it. What you have is a more or less universal way that the church thinks about it. But then on the other hand, you have Augustine, and he has very peculiar formulations of all this stuff unique to himself. And those formulations, because of the tightness and care with which he advances them, become more or less the way that the Western Church subsequently ends up thinking. So the Augustinian mentality is the interesting rose-colored spectacles through which you begin to interpret everything else. So in other words, this is not only affecting the way that you think about fundamental philosophical or core theological concepts, this also becomes a way by which you think about texts. Because one of the things that pops out of what Augustine is doing is, number one, the fact that nobody else is doing it. So we have to justify following Augustine with a theory of dogmatic development. That
Right.
we completely change the way that we understand texts.
The origin of the progressive idea.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's what it is. He's the first progressive. Yeah.
Wow. So at the same time that this classical catechism is being developed, right? Forgive me if I don't use the correct words, but at, this sort of 280 to 450, this amazing period of development of the Trinitarian Christianity, making it all make sense, essentially, right?
Now, let me stop you. It's very important to understand, they're not inventing this and foisting it off on an unsuspecting public. What they're doing is they are, and the process began almost immediately with the rise of Christianity itself. In other words, this goes all the way back to the time of Christ. What they're doing is responding to questions that people are asking. And in the process of responding, they're noticing certain things about the database with which they have to work, namely the texts of the New Testament. So in other words, they're not formulating things out of thin air. This is very important to understand. What they're doing is more or less what a scientist does when they're confronted with a body of evidence. They're trying to formulate a conceptual framework that can deal with the vast majority of the data in that body of evidence. So in other words, the doctrine of the Trinity isn't being imposed on the text. What I'm suggesting is it's emerging from the text. But with Augustine, what you have is a different way of building that framework. And as a result, the framework collapses because he's trying to do things that simply the text will not bear. And this is what I'm trying to get at. You're not.
He divides by zero. And
he divides by
collapses.
Zero. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And now that's was that done because what was his putative reasoning? Was it because he wanted to graft Greek philosophy onto Christianity? What was his motivation?
Well, that was in part of it. He misunderstood what the Greek fathers were doing. The Greek fathers used Greek philosophical terms all the time. But you'll notice when you study them that they're not using those terms in their philosophical sense. They are literally using the kind of colloquial resonance of those terms, but the actual definition or use of the terms themselves reveals the fact that they're thinking about these fundamental concepts in a very different way than Greek philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
For example, well, let me give you a specific example. The term apostasis in Greek literally means that which stands under. In other words, it's the Greek word for substance. Okay? That word is the word that the Greek fathers will use to mean personhood. So in other words, what they're doing is they're suggesting to you that the fundamental foundation of thinking and of concept in their universe is not an abstract substance, but rather the fundamental substance is personhood itself. Follow me?
Yeah, I do.
Augustine looks at the Latin term substantia, which is the term that he would have been familiar as translating the Greek word hypostasis, and he's understanding substantia in its full, unreconstructed philosophical sense, number one.
Wow.
So right away he's misunderstanding what the Greek and some of his own Latin contemporaries are thinking and why they're thinking it. Okay? The second thing he's trying to do, quite literally, with his theological formulation is, believe it or not, he's really trying to defend the full deity and divinity of Christ. That's what he's trying to do. But what he does in trying to do it is he ends up accepting most of the principles of people that the Eastern Fathers had already addressed as heresies, and he reproduces that whole structure almost in toto, thinking he's defending the deity of Christ, when in fact what he's doing is he's taking away that. So in other words, Augustine will say something to the effect that and listen again to the order of concepts in this little statement. He says that the most illustrious example of our predestination is Christ. Let me repeat that. The most illustrious example of our predestination is Christ.
That sounds ludicrous to me.
Well, what he's saying is we've got the general principle of predestination, but we're not drawing any of that principle from a direct consideration of Christ himself, but rather we establish the general principle and he becomes an example of it. Okay, so in other words, we're back with Anselm. In fine, leaving Christ altogether out of view, as if nothing had been known of him, we shall attempt to prove by absolute reasons why it was altogether necessary for God to become man. So in other words, once again, the whole scholastic enterprise is unfolding from these very few simple premises. You're dealing with the God in general of the philosophers, is what you're dealing with. And that God increasingly takes over and increasingly comes to abandon the Christian veneer which has been associated with it. So, the Reformation...
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So what I'm telling you is the current cultural situation of the West, which seems to have developed overnight, really hasn't. You're just living in the final death throes, the final denouement of the whole logic of the system. The system is collapsing, as we can all see. But it's collapsing not for political and not for some sort of vague, generalized spirituality and all of that. It's collapsing for certain specific conceptual, and I'm going to say the word theological reasons. That's why.
Well, I always tell people who are atheists, I say, well, everyone has a theology, even atheists, but only people who are religious will admit it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's quite true.
Yeah. All right. So we have this guy, Augustine of Hippo. He's the world's first progressive in the West, or the West's first progressive. He, is a bull in a china shop, misunderstands the meaning, has the wrong dictionary, if you will, and mistranslates the Greek. And then he takes a sledgehammer to all the crystal in the store. And wrecks the whole thing, but he gets elevated. Why does he get elevated?
Well, because at the time that he's writing, he's literally one of the last teaching fathers, and he has a well-deserved, earned reputation for real sanctity. So the man becomes very influential. That's the first reason. The second reason is that when you when you read Augustine, he's quite a wordsmith. He can easily distract you with very polished Latin rhetoric. You know, he was a typical educated Latin, so he was quite familiar with all of the nuances and elegances of Latin rhetoric. That's the second thing. The third thing is that because of the second thing, you often find him dodging the implications of his own logic by disguising it in an order of asking questions that serves to disguise it.
Interesting. So he's running from his own dissonance.
He's running from his own dissonance. Yes. Yeah. And the other thing you've got to remember is like all these people, he's writing incidentally. He's a bishop who is having to handle theological controversies as they occur. So in other words, he didn't sit down to write a systematic theology one day. That was about the farthest thing from his mind. He's just whipping off these treatises and firing them out there as situations arise. So you get an inconsistency from anyone who does that. You know, anyone who's ever written. You know, I've written 40 books. Now, don't tell me that there are not inconsistencies in them, because there are. You know, I go back and read them and I find them all the time. Well, Augustine is doing the same thing. So there are several reasons, I think, that led the West to look on him as kind of the father of the fathers, and I get into some of that in the second book in that 4-volume series. But the one that I think is the most important for our purposes is the fact that he disguises, he keeps the logic from himself by inserting all these simply unnecessary steps in some of his thinking, and it's that kind of, in my opinion, kind of prevents him at certain times from seeing what he's really saying.
Wow.
Yeah, it's and he will say, and you know, to me the most problematical work that he ever wrote was the work that the West thinks, by and large, is his greatest work. And that's and you know, and again we're right back to square one. It's his book, the De Trinitate, on the Trinity. Well, it's interesting when you read that book, and a confused and turgid work it certainly is. But when you read it, he says something to the effect that I will not be offended or insulted if people discover I've made an error. So, you know, when I've made an error, correct me, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting that he puts that little comment in that work. It's almost as if he knows that, okay, I'm really way out here on this one. So he knows that there may be problems, I think, with some of his formulations.
Right, but he's not skilled because he's not systematic. He's not skilled in seeing the implications of his own work. Right. Now, at the same time that all of this sort of classical Trinitarianism and Christianity is happening, Rome is declining, right?
Yes.
Rome has gone from its high age, you know, of course, one of the most vicious regimes ever, right? But also one of the most magnificent in some ways as well. You know, a pagan, you know, Mediterranean empire, right, extending all the way up into Great Britain and touching into Germany, and then down all the way to Iran, practically, and on the north coast of Africa. I mean, there's all these cultures intersecting, and then Christianity is adopted, right, as the religion of Rome, right? And what kind of effects does Roman culture have on Christianity itself?
Well, huge.
Right.
because the Roman Empire, the real contest between the empire and the church when they were, at loggerheads with each other, was, of course, over burning incense to Caesar, and the Christians refusing to do that. And it's instructive to understand why this was such a deal for not only the Christian church, but for the Roman emperors. Because in that act, what you really are doing is you are acknowledging the genius of Roman administration. It's their equivalent of the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. That's what it represents. It's
wow.
It's not only a religious, it's a cultural acknowledgement that you are recognizing that there is a genius to Roman administration, and it's personified in the person of the emperor. Okay? Because we have to remember, the emperor is proclaimed by what? Well, the emperor is proclaimed by the Senate. SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanorum, the Senate and people of Rome. So, in other words, the whole dictatorship is really a kind of final step to this whole process of the genius of the empire and its administration. So you had all of these cultures within what amounted to a kind of classical version of technocracy. The church, on the other hand, comes already kind of prefabricated, preassembled. It's got its own hierarchical system, which means essentially that it has its own system of government. It has a kind of autonomous culture from everything else, and in that it's claiming not only to have a kind of autonomous culture or ritual, it's claiming finality and universality for that. So there was bound to be a conflict. So what happens, I think, with the conversion of Constantine, of course, is he removes Christianity from the persecution list, and ultimately, it by that point, it's become more or less the de facto religion of the empire anyway. So this sets up, I think, the condition of what the East Romans or the Byzantine people would call the symphony, that acknowledgement that we've got two different powers here, and they're going to be kind of more or less trying to act in concert. Now, that's the theory. We all know what happened in practice. The loggerheads continued. The emperors who tried to muddle in doctrine usually wound up on the short end of the stick, and the church said, no, we're not buying this or that particular imperial formulation just because we want to keep Egypt in the empire.
Right.
So it led to all sorts of stuff.
So they had the pragmatic day-to-day governance issues in the late empire, and they tried to shoehorn the doctrine in order to keep the empire together. And distorting it further.
Well, classic case in point here is the Emperor Heraclius the Great. Heraclius the Great, as we know, was the East Roman emperor that basically put paid once and for all to the aspirations of the Persian Empire. He just finally destroyed it, and any opportunity that it would ever have of expanding westward once and for all. And in the process, he reconquers reconquers Egypt and so on. And as a result of reconquering Egypt and the massive amount of Coptic Christians in Egypt, who were by that point in history separated from the rest of the Eastern churches, well, to bring them back into the doctrinal fold, he becomes an official backer of a heresy known as monothelitism or one-willism, if you want to translate it literally.
What is that?
Well, that's for another time. But basically, it's the doctrine that Christ has one will. Okay? So this becomes his way of trying to reabsorb the Coptics in Egypt back into the imperial ecclesiastical fold. In the process, he tangles with Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, who's the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and a fellow by the name of Maximus the Confessor, who both deny the doctrine that Heraclius pushes. And on top of that, and on top of having an ecclesiastical schism to deal with, having dispatched of the Persian Empire, he weakens the Byzantine Empire right around the time that we just see the rise of, guess what, Islam, and the kind of proto-Islamic beginnings at that period in history. So all of this is happening at the same point. But my point here is that the idea of the symphony sounds rosy, but the way it actually works out in practice is every time that the imperial power departs too significantly from the church's orthodoxy, it's usually the state power that ends up paying for it. So it's a very rocky relationship. It's never really entirely smoothed out, because really what happens with Constantine and those emperors after him is it's less a surrender of the church to the empire or the empire to the church. It's more of an armistice. It's a ceasefire.
Wow.
Yeah,
so the
terms of the ceasefire are never really fully negotiated. You know.
Wow. So there was no resolution of the fundamental issues.
Right. Well, just look at today. Is there really any final resolution to the relationship even today between the church and the state in any Western nation? No, there isn't. There isn't.
And the armistice seems to be breaking down.
The armistice is breaking down. The state is claiming more and more power as the influence of the various churches wanes. But don't make the mistake of assuming that that influence is ever going to completely go away or roll over and play dead. That's when it really becomes dangerous, as a matter of fact. Because you'll find, again, this happens repeatedly in history. There will arise at some point, usually, some clergyman or nun or monk somewhere that simply refuses to go along with whatever crazy idea whatever emperor or president or somebody has at the time. And, at that point, the fight is on again. So,
well, there was an article that came out about the Vatican yesterday or a couple of days ago where Pope Francis said the biggest problem is the church is that people are not willing to follow Francis.
Yeah, well, gee, I've got bad news for him. Half of the Christian world has not been paying attention to the papacy for 1,000 years. So,
Yeah. Well, let me go back.
It's not a new deal.
Right. Let me go back to the Roman emperors and the church. Well, the church's configuration was brotherly. Right? It wasn't paternal, right? So you went from this brotherly model of Christianity where the various religious authorities were in communion with one another and they sort of resolved their differences, human behavior being what it is. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but hardly, right. But essentially there was a bunch of armistices among these various things where it kind of kept it together. And then it gets accepted by the ultimate paternal system in human history, which is the Roman Empire. Right. Which is top down, centralized, bureaucratic, sort of like a analog or, pre-digital,
you have
technocracy.
The real difference between the Roman Empire and the organization of the early Catholic Church during that period. And by Catholic, folks, please understand, I do not mean papal. Okay?
Right.
Catholic is a Greek word that is formed from two other words, kath and holy. And the word literally means according to the whole, or according to the fullness, if you will. It has nothing to do with the Bishop of Rome, and it has nothing to do with mere universality. Nothing at all.
Well, what we call the Catholic Church refers to itself as the Roman Catholic Church, right?
Right.
You have to make sure you continue to attach the preamble, right?
Right. Well, Well, you could say that the Orthodox Church is a Roman Catholic Church because the members of the empire, the citizens of the empire, did not call themselves Greeks, and they did not call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans.
Wow.
So if you're in the Byzantine Empire and someone says they're a Roman Catholic, it would make perfect sense to you, and it wouldn't mean anything papal whatsoever.
So what we see afterwards.
In fact,
yeah.
in modern day Turkey, if you write the Patriarchate of Constantinople, do you know how you address the Patriarchate of Constantinople?
No idea.
It's addressed as Roman Patriarchate, Patriarchate.
Oh, wow.
It's the Roman Patriarchate to this day.
Wow.
So in other words, folks, you've just got to understand that the West and the East are two different entities. They were at one time one, and you're not going to understand all of this stuff going on right now between this country and Russia without understanding that one country thinks that it is the exceptional nation and the logical end development of Western civilization, and the other country looks at that whole development and says it's nuts.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the problem. So going back to Rome, look what you have. You have, with the empire, a centralized administration. You've got a centralized administrative state. Okay? Look what you have with the church. With the church, you have a very decentralized system that ultimately owes its governance to local bishops. And insofar as there's any centralized system of authority, that is represented by councils of bishops. So you're dealing even there with basic differences of outlook and administration that are fundamentally different. So are there going to be...
Yeah, fraternal versus patriarchal.
Well, even in that brotherly system, the bishop is understood to be the father of all ministry in the church. So even at the local level, you're dealing with a paternal system, but it's a much less, it's simply not a centralized system. What keeps the whole thing together, quite literally, is commonality of ritual practice and commonality of certain core beliefs. In other words, there's a certain way that worship itself is conducted, no matter where you are in that big churchy world at the time. You can be in Ireland and take a trip from Ireland to Constantinople and see more or less the same type of thinking at work in their ritual. So the thing is held together by different means than merely it's held together by culture rather than by administrative means. So it's a very different outlook. It's something that's very hard to communicate to a modern Westerner. But it's becoming easier to understand because the modern Westerner, by dint of long cultural conditioning, also senses that something is very wrong with his civilization and culture. Yeah, there is. It's breaking down. And the administrative state is proving incapable of keeping it together because that's never what kept it together in the first place. We're in a mess.
Bureaucracy is never enough.
Bureaucracy is never enough. I mean, the Soviets tried that. The Soviet Union was a technocracy. So was Nazi Germany. And those bureaucracies, those bureaucratic states, simply cannot reduce human experience to a scientific formula. It's people have tried and tried and tried. Plato and the Republic tried it, and it's always a failure.
So when the papal claims were published, when they were adopted, is that the Pope basically claiming himself to be the new emperor?
Well, yeah. That part of the story is elaborated over several centuries, but I think you have certain distinguishable stages in the process. You have the early period of the papacy after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, where the bishops of Rome, just by dint of being bishops of Rome, have a certain status or respect that other local bishops do not have, plus the fact that the Bishop of Rome prior to this period was basically more or less the Patriarchate of the West, which it was.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the period, the crucial period of the pontificates from Leo III up to John VIII, and including Nicholas I. These three popes are hugely important for the story. Leo III.
And what years were they operating?
I will get there.
Okay.
And John VIII. Leo III was pope from about 795 to 813. Nicholas I was pope from let's just say circa 869 to 871. He's pope at a very crucial period. We'll get back to him. And John VIII is the pope who sent delegates to patch up the schism that Nicholas I had made to Constantinople. Now, why are these three popes important? Leo III was the pope that crowned Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans, on December 25th in the year 800 in the Lateran Basilica in Rome. I cannot emphasize strongly enough for people to understand this, because the way that the West to this day in graduate schools of history in this country and all over Europe, to this day, the way the West understands the pontificate of Leo III is completely and 100% wrong.
Whoa.
What the West understands that Leo III did was that Leo III cast the lot of the papacy with the Holy Roman Empire and cut its ties with the Byzantine Roman Empire. In actual fact, what Leo III did was he erected 2 silver shields of the creed in Latin and Greek without the Augustinian formulation of the creed. And between these 2 shields, he put up another little silver plaque that read Ego, his scutos, ego leo, cautela et amore fidei orthodoxae, I believe was the Latin. I'm going by memory there. But basically the Latin phrase that Leo erected between these 2 shields was, I, Leo, have erected these shields out of a love for and as a safeguard of the Orthodox faith.
Wow.
That's what they said. And he prohibited. He had to, and he prohibited the Carolingian, the Charlemagnian Church, from using the Augustinian formulation of the Trinity. He absolutely prohibited it. In other words, basically what he did by doing that was he said, my entire patriarchal church is doing something wrong, and I'm telling it to stop.
Wow.
That's what he did. Yeah.
That's huge.
That it is gigantically huge. You know, and I cover this in the book because there's quite an ecclesiastical tug of war going on in the background, and Leo ends up in the center of it. So Leo is completely misread by the West. Nicholas I becomes pope as kind of the first of the Germanizing popes. And he not only is pushing the Augustinian doctrine, but he's using that doctrine to get a toehold into the recently converted Bulgarians and establish Roman jurisdiction over the Bulgarian church. And he also excommunicates Photius, who had been made Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, for intruding on someone else's say. So in other words, Nicholas ushers in the first real break between Rome and Constantinople.
It's Egypt all over again.
Yes, exactly. It's Egypt
Yeah.
all over again. And the other thing he does is he tries to enlist the help of the Carolingian theologians to defend their Augustinian doctrine against the East, which is refusing to accept it and refusing to accept Nicholas's early version of papal claims. So in other words, look at what Nicholas has now done. He's the first popish pope to really press papal claims. And he's tied those claims to that Augustinian doctrine of the Trinity.
So what problem was he trying to solve?
He wasn't trying to solve any problem. He was trying to get Constantinople to recognize his authority to interfere with a jurisdictional problem in a local church.
So it's the Roman Reich.
Right, essentially.
Yeah.
That schism continues until John VIII becomes pope, and John VIII does a complete reversal of the policy of Nicholas I. He tries to patch things up with Photius, and as a result sends legates to a council in Constantinople. It's sometimes called the Eighth Ecumenical Council, and that council prohibits the Augustinian addition to the creed, and again the papacy accepts that. So
wow.
the ninth century is when we really see the first attempt not only to articulate papal claims, but to impose them on a sister church.
Wow.
Now, what happens between the 9th century and the 11th century, when the schism finally is on, is you have a struggle within Rome between the let's just call them the Germanizers and the old traditional senatorial families that had controlled the papacy up to this point. The Germanizers finally managed to win control. Of course, you can think of Hildebrand, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregory the Seventh. They finally gained control. The fellow that you have to think of in this respect would be Leo IX. Once he becomes Pope, he takes down those silver shields in Rome that Leo III had erected. He takes down that little silver plaque in between the shields that Leo had erected, and he accepts the Augustinian formulation of the creed in Rome. And bang, that's in the year 1014. At that moment, Constantinople removes the papacy, removes Leo IX from the diptychs. In other words, Constantinople says we are no longer in communion with Rome. That's what the diptychs are. They're patriarchal lists of who they are in communion with. All right. So at that moment, in other words, the schism is on. It's actually 1014. When 1054 rolls around, Cardinal Humbert de Silva Canada is sent by the papacy to Constantinople to patch up the already existing schism, and we all know what happened. Humbert was a hothead, and he literally storms into the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople during liturgy, during the Mass, as the Patriarch is celebrating the Mass, and the Cardinal storms up to the altar, slams the bull of excommunication down on the altar as the Mass is going on, and storms out. And that is what most people date as the finalization of the schism, and indeed that's the way I kind of look at it. And the Patriarch responds in kind. He patiently finishes the Mass and calls his synod of bishops together and formally excommunicates the papacy, and the schism is on. And it's after that point of the schism between the East and the West, it's after this point that you see in the Western Church, you see increasingly shrill proclamations of papal authority. You can think of Innocent III, or Cardinal Conte, to give him his secular name. You can think of people like this and their proclamations of papal authority. Boniface VIII, of course, in the 1302, I think it was, the bull Unum Sanctum, where he says we altogether define and pronounce. We hereby define, declare, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary for every human creature to be, and listen to the words here, to be subject to the Roman Pontiff.
Whoa.
Not in communion with, but subject to. And you'll notice that it's a subjection that has no doctrinal content. All that's necessary is that you be subject to the Roman Pontiff.
That's anti-Christian.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. There, for all you dispensationalists out there, there is your real spirit of Antichrist rising in the temple. Because that's what the church is. Has nothing to do with that little country in the Mediterranean on the eastern edge of it. Nothing.
And abandonment of divine license.
It's the abandonment of the traditional order of church governance and church order.
Wow.
Because
doctrine.
And doctrine, because you'll notice something else, again, this is all in the book, God, History, and Dialectic, because there's something else that happens in the Western Church because of this. When a bishop is consecrated prior to this point in the West, the ceremony, the ritual of consecration is very similar to what it is to this day in the East. The bishop is vested in the office of vestments of the bishop, and at the consecration ceremony, he reads out what's called an oros, or definition of the faith, and that's literally what it is. It's a definition of the central doctrines of the Catholic Church. And the reason it's read out is that, and in the old system, the bishop would actually write up his own personal statement rather than read a formula in a book. But the reason why that was done was they were ensuring that the apostolic faith was, because that's what the episcopacy is, it's the continuity or continuation of the apostolic office. What they're doing is they're ensuring that the apostolic succession itself is being transmitted. It's not simply the transmission of an authority of an office. The authority of that office is to maintain the faith. So in other words, you've got to make sure that the faith is being transmitted to the person you're making a bishop. That's why all of this is being done. But what happens in the Western Church to the order of the consecration of a bishop after these claims begin to be formulated and insisted upon is that the oath of faithfulness or the oath of faith is changed into a juramentum fidelitas, into an oath of fidelity to the Bishop of Rome.
Wow, that's complete and total abandonment.
It is complete and total abandonment. Yeah, it is. It is. And it's small wonder that within, after the schism, it took a mere 500 years to have the Protestant Reformation. And we need to remember there were significant kind of false starts to the Protestant Reformation before that, the Hussites in Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. So it did not take long for, the supreme ultimate claim to authority to begin breaking down. Because again, no bureaucratic system is going to be competent enough to maintain a technocratic, purely administrative rule over something this massive and quite frankly, culturally diverse as the situation was. It simply could not be done.
And it's proto-materialist as well.
Of course it is. Yes, it's proto-materialist. Yeah. Absolutely. Because you again in this system, just at the time, it's interesting to me to note that at the time that you have people like Boniface VIII insisting on what he's insisting on in Unum Sanctum, it's interesting to me to note that it is right at the same time that you begin to see the nominalist-realist debates going full tilt. So,
and what are those debates, just for the audience who doesn't know what those are?
Okay, nominalism is the idea that there are no generalized real categories. In other words, things like wisdom, justice, holiness, and so on, those are simply names. They have no real content or existence. They're simply convenient names that we use, and they're all equivalent to each other.
That sounds like the LGBT gender thing going on right now.
That's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is. It's the reduction of reality to linguistic manipulation. And the interesting thing about nominalism is, again, if you look at what the nominalists are saying and go all the way back 800 years earlier to Augustine's De Trinitate, he's saying exactly the same thing and setting up the whole program.
Wow.
So, and I realize that for a Western listener who's gone through a modern American philosophy course and had to study with nominalism and study about nominalism and realism, I realize that he will never or she will never learn that it has its roots in the De Trinitate of Augustine of Hippo. But that's my point. The West is incapable of understanding its own history because it's adopted a flawed version of that history in its doctrine. It is incapable of understanding itself, and it is incapable of understanding the eastern part of its own civilization because it has already made itself the canonical measure of what constitutes European civilization.
Using its own broken ruler.
It's using its own broken ruler to try and measure things. It's like trying to do relativity theory with a Newtonian metric.
Yeah.
it's not going to work. So,
and what was the other one? Nominalism was one. What was the other one?
Realism. In other words, that universal terms have a real existence.
Right.
That they are real. That's a simplistic way to put it, but but basically, it's the idea that these things do not reduce to mere labels. They're not mere attributes. And again, I'm going back to something else that's also in the book. When the early fathers speak of things like wisdom, justice, holiness, ubiquity, whatever they're talking about in terms of God, the West is going to call those things attributes. They are things that we attribute to God, but they have no real independent underlying existence or reality.
That's scary. That sounds scary to me.
Of course it is. The East doesn't even call that second category attributes at all. It calls those things energies or operations. They're not things that God is, they are things that God ever eternally does.
Yeah. So like in Buddhism, for example, there's this there's Tara. Let's say green Tara is example, right? It's just one of many. In green Tara, Tara is always depicted as sitting in a seated lotus position, but her leg is actually touching the floor. One of her legs is moving, like she's getting off the plinth.
Right.
And the meaning of that is that green Tara is the impulse to help others. So she's actually in the process, in the operation of getting up from her plinth to go assist someone. Right.
Well, my point in raising this is you're dealing again. The terminology is trying to tell you that there's a vast, huge difference of mentality going on.
Yeah.
Attributes fill the West's desire to have everything defined.
Yeah.
Energies tells you that the East is saying you can't define the underlying reality at all. You can only understand its manifestations, and those manifestations are eternally active.
And the impulse to tyranny and rigidity.
Right. Yeah. It's of a piece. So,
right.
We're dealing with kind of meta-cultural issues here, but that truly is what is at stake. To boil it down to a nutshell, I don't personally think that the West is going to survive. It's already in the period or state of collapse. That does not mean that I think that Christian culture or civilization is going to die in the West. On the contrary, it may have a tremendous rebirth, but it's not going to resemble the last 800 years at all.
Wow.
If the West wakes up and returns to its original orthodoxy, it's going to look very different. But there are going to be parts of it that look very familiar. But if on the other hand the world wants to get rid of it altogether, and that will require getting rid of Russia, by the way, folks.
Yeah.
Then it's going to be a very ugly world, like it or not.
Right. I mean, look at the architecture where it's going.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right,
we can't even build a traditional church in the West anymore. It's just it's unreal.
So then we have the rise of Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just look at the difficulties they're having rebuilding Notre Dame in Paris. They want to turn it into some sort of modern temple of spirituality. Whatever. They're not going to try and rebuild the thing in its any sort of original form, and that frightens me.
I think they abandoned that idea.
Oh, they did? Well, good. If they did, yay.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview from an American who is really skilled with woodwork, architectural woodwork, like the structure. And he uses ancient techniques to work with wood. And so he was invited to come to Paris to help them fix some of the structural elements that were damaged in the fire. So they've got
I hope that's true.
Yeah, they've got.
I really do.
I didn't know it until my daughter visited Paris recently, and that's when I found that out. So.
Oh wow. Okay, that's news to me. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think that was an attempt by the Macroni, and that crowd. To try to turn that church into part of some 30-minute city, but I think he failed, and I think that the traditionalists won out on that. Thank God for that,
Well, good.
Yeah, so I wanted to get to, so we have these three popes, the schism arrives, the schism gets worse because you've got this sort of power play between the forces of, let's just call it empirism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus the fraternal Christianity. You've got these, forces of power versus these portions or these sections of trying to keep things meaningful. So you have one group that's trying to preserve the meaning, the purpose of Christianity, and you have this other group that's like, we only care about power, right? We want to control everything because, but you've got an industrial architecture behind that empire, right? So you probably have the corporations of the Roman day and after the Rome collapsed. You've got these corporations, if you will, or these combines, as Jefferson would call them, that are busy in the background trying to secure their signatures for growing and preserving their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's this, and then you get into the banking aspect of that, which is, the oil that's sort of greasing all the skids, right? Mm-hmm. And right. So this is all going on, and then you had secularism that sort of really formulates into something that you can see, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so secularism kind of arises, and the secular humanism kind of takes off in the West. What is the East's reaction to secular humanism?
Well, it depends on the period that you're looking at. And if you're looking at, the Bolshevik period or the Soviet Union, they're going to be all for it. Because
but what I'm talking about in the 1300s, I think there was a secularist.
I get what you're saying. Well,
yeah.
It's a complex question, but during a particular period within late Byzantine Roman history, there did arise within Byzantium a group of people that are quite literally known as the humanists. That their whole thing was that they were Byzantine Romans that looked at the developing high scholasticism that they saw going on in the West, and they admired it, and they wanted to basically import that whole outlook and so on into the East. And they made several overtures to people in the West, and you can count the de Medici family in that whole group, because of course Cosimo de Medici was the one that tracked down the Greek text of the Hermetica through contact with some of these people, and then later went on to publish a translation, Ficino's translation of the Hermetica. So you had that whole, during the end of the High Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, you had that whole development in concert with the so-called Byzantine humanists. The problem that you have in the East is that humanism never becomes, nor could it become, a widespread thing as it did in the West, for a very simple reason. When Russia and basically the Slavic peoples were converted to Orthodoxy by Kirill and Methodius, those two are widely known saints within Slavic Christianity, because they're basically the ones that are credited with bringing Christianity to the Slavs and inventing the early Cyrillic alphabet. This is the key point. They were linguists, and what they did was they gave the Slavic peoples a written alphabet, which was in turn used to translate the texts of the liturgy and so on and so forth. So in other words, in Russia's case, you have no equivalent of the classical pagan heritage that is common to the Latin West and the Greek East. There's nothing like it. You simply have a whole literate culture that springs up quite literally out of the Orthodox liturgy and the texts that accompany it and embody it, including the scripture. So there's no equivalent of an Aristotle or so on. There is, of course, there are pre-Christian Slavic fairy tales and so on, but they only get written down after this conversion. So there's no equivalent in Russia's case to this classical pagan inheritance that you have in both the eastern and western parts of the empire. That's a huge thing. It's a huge, huge thing. So you're dealing with a very different outlook, and that means that humanism, in the sense that we know it in the West, or even that a Byzantine Roman would have known it in the 13th or 14th century, it simply never is there. It never gets there. And when you see in Russia, you see this westernizing influence. Think of Peter the Great, or think of Count Tolstoy in the 9th century or 19th century. When you get those kinds of people in Russia, they're always kind of an oddity. They're, in some sense, they're at odds with their own culture. You can see this particularly with Peter the Great. And then as a result of this phenomenon, you inevitably get within Russia, you get a reaction. This becomes particularly true in the 19th century with the Slavophiles, who emphasized not Russia's need to turn west, but the need for Russia to understand and really get down to the very basics of its own cultural, liturgical, orthodox, theological inheritance if it ever wants to be really Russian. And we're seeing that again being revived today with people like Alexander Dugin and so on. So the tension that is in Eastern European countries, particularly those that have Orthodox Christian majorities, is much different than the tensions that you have in the West. It's of a different character, and that's the crucial thing to note. I think one of the interesting things about our current situation right now, Kelly, with the conflict in the Ukraine that we see going on, and with some of the other things that we see going on within Russia, but to a lesser extent in countries like Romania or Bulgaria. The interesting thing that has happened is that I think the westernizers in Russia particularly are seeing the West for what it is and realizing that this no longer represents a viable path forward for Russia. The example I'm thinking in particular of is the former Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev himself, because Medvedev, up until very recently, was counted by Westerners as an Atlanticist, in other words, as one of those westernizing Russians that thought that part of Russia's future lay in maintaining its ties and developing more Western cultural attitudes. Medvedev is no longer singing that tune at all.
Yeah, I think you could see that on his Telegram page.
Yeah. And what the significance of this is that I think this has to be understood as representing the denouement of the end of that whole tendency within Russian society that has gone back to Peter the Great. I don't think you're ever going to see that kind of Westernism emerge in Russia again. And I fully expect at the conclusion of the Ukrainian war, the Ukrainians are going to wake up and realize that, hey, we've been played for a bunch of fools for the last 100 or so years by various Western powers, Germany and the United States being right at the top of the list. And we need to return to our own, Slavic roots. I think that's an inevitability. What I also think this means, though, is that part of the civilizational world is eventually going to come into some profound cultural clash with the other major components of its system of alliances, namely China and Iran. I don't see the cultural underpinnings of the whole BRICS group lasting for very long because of
that's interesting.
Well, I mean, just stop and look what you have. You've got in the case of communist China, you've got basically a Han dynasty that's struggling to survive and keep its decrepit, corrupt system together. And, that whole Confucian system with its Maoist overtones is not working. And it has little in common with the Christian civilization of Russia, other than perhaps an understanding that, you've got to have the mandate of heaven or, things are going to be going pretty bad for you.
Yeah.
The other side of this equation is Iran. You've got essentially a Shia theocracy in that country, which again is not in good shape. It's not popular, but it is a very different culture than that of contemporary Orthodox Russia. So again, I don't think the cultural underpinnings are there, because you can't make an alliance simply on opposition. What holds that alliance together is they're all opposed to the United States. Well, the United States is not looking too good politically or culturally right now, and there goes the canine home security alert unit.
Hello, Shiloh.
She's barking at thank you, Shiloh. She's barking at the garbage man. Thank you.
So what we do have some things in common, even though it doesn't look that way. But you have a theocracy or a theocratic state in Iran, right?
Right.
The mullahs basically have the royal veto, right?
Right.
And in Russia, you have the Patriarchate of Moscow, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has basically a theological veto over the actions of the state, theoretically. And then in China, you also have kind of a similar kind of analog to that, in the sense that there is a doctrine at the heart of this Confucius Marxist fusion, which itself is probably unstable.
Yeah, I think so.
And partly because Marxism as an economic system was never going to work, right?
Right.
And you also have some similarity with China with respect to the West, because they, basically the Han Dynasty, Communist Party out of Beijing has a kind of a golden share of all the corporations, just like the Crown does, right? So does that kind of thing exist in Russia? Does the state have a golden share in the corporations?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So they're similar in that structure.
What we have to understand is that in terms of Russia, the military industrial complex has been always more or less Byzantine in its basic structure and outlines. That is to say that if you look at Venice, for example, the Republic of Venice had the state arsenal, where they made all their galleys and cannon and so on and so forth. This was an actual corporation that the Venetian Republic set up and owned. And that in turn was based on very Byzantine models. This was the way the Byzantine military was organized. It was kind of a quasi-private, quasi-state, quasi-feudal system. Well, that same system, of course, was imported into Tsarist Russia, and with but a minimum of camouflage, was really basically the system that underlay the Soviet Union. And you see the same system reemerge after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early years of the Yeltsin regime, when it was quite literally the Moscow Patriarchate, in the form of the current patriarch, he was then a metropolitan, that stepped into the picture of the Soviet defense industries and literally made sure that all of those nuclear defense installations and so on and so forth were provided for so that the people weren't thrown out of work, and that the nuclear arsenal itself was kept more or less under the watchful eye of somebody with a connection to the state, in this case the Moscow Patriarchate. So there's a fascinating book out there that's called Russian Nuclear Orthodoxy that goes into the relationship between the Russian Church and the Soviet nuclear defense industry after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a fascinating story because it was literally the church that stepped in and saved the Russian nuclear deterrent, if you want to kind of...
Wow. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. But again, it's a different mentality.
Right.
The mentality in Byzantium was that during the litany, during Mass, you would pray for our Christ-loving emperor and our Christ-bearing armies. There's no pacifism in that view, and it's a mentality that seems foreign to us in the West. For one thing, we couldn't pray such a prayer because, number one, our leaders probably don't love Christ, and our armies certainly don't represent him.
Yeah.
So it's a different mentality, but it's very similar to the mentality you find with the Chinese emperors, in a way.
Yeah. So I remember after the Soviet Union fell, there was this. Yeah, I think it was under Clinton. There was this narrative and then a program to help Russia secure its nuclear weapons.
Right.
Was that really kind of like trying to find the Kemmler lab after World War II, or at the end of World War II?
No, what I think was going on there, and I thought this at the time, is I thought that this was an effort by the West to head off precisely what I thought was going on, which was the church is stepping in and making sure that these scientists still have jobs and roofs over their heads. We don't want, what they were trying to prevent was the complete disassembly of the Russian military-industrial complex.
But the West was trying to take advantage of that vacuum.
To take advantage of it and take it away, precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. But they were prevented from doing so.
There's a reason they hate orthodoxy.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they made it seem like, in the press, in the Western press at the time, they made it seem like they were successful in doing this. They were successful to the extent that they were able to talk the Ukraine into giving up the nuclear weapons that were on its territory, and right.
We need to remember that places like Bielorussia and so on in the Ukraine were home to Russian ICBM strategic nuclear missile silos. So in other words,
wow.
When the Ukraine did that, they were giving up but the problem is that the Russians were able to insist that you give those back to us. So in other words, the West managed a transfer of some of those assets back to Russian control. I do strongly suspect that they took some of those assets and disassembled them and studied the state of Russian technology. But a lot of
that was thwarted by the Patriarchate.
Yeah, but places. Yeah, what I'm getting at is places like Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk or places that had
right
a large.
The secret cities
that were large. The secret cities that were such large components of the Soviet nuclear infrastructure.
Triad, yeah.
That those places were more or less kept alive. In fact, by some very carefully timed and judiciously placed interventions by the church, and in particular by the current patriarch, who was back then a metropolitan.
Right.
And we have to remember that in the Soviet Union, many of the hierarchs of the church were also in double roles as agents for the KGB.
Right.
So in other words, again, that may seem very foreign to Western ears. Well, they're nothing but agents of the KGB, and there's no real church. No, that's not the way to look at it either.
Right.
That's another feature of the way that the East thinks of its relationship. Remember, it's a symphony. So, that whole relationship was not new to the Soviets. It goes back to Peter the Great, and for that matter,
right.
You can go all the way back to the Byzantine Empire. So,
well, the essence of a symphony is you're all playing off the same score.
Playing off the same score, exactly. So, It's rather like saying that, and I've used this analogy before, and I used to use it when I was teaching Russian history to American students. It's rather like saying that suddenly the United States determines that the Mormon Church is a national security risk, and it directs the FBI to keep an eye on the Mormons. Well, what's the best way to do that? Well, you go out and recruit a bunch of Mormons.
Right.
So, pretty soon you've got a bunch of Mormons running a whole department of the FBI.
Right. And the tail is wagging the dog.
And the tail is wagging the dog. Yeah, this is how it works. So, this is precisely what happened in the Soviet Union, and it's precisely what happened in Peter the Great's Russia, and so on. So, it's nothing new.
Right. So just to get back to the history element just a little bit, so when does Freemasonry and other secret societies get into the picture of what was happening in Western Europe? When did that sort of appear to have emerged? Well,
that's a very good question. If we're to believe Masonic scholars themselves, their fraternity goes all the way back to Egypt, and I do think that some of those Masons that have investigated their own history have made some pretty interesting and at least worthy of consideration cases. But in terms of what we're talking about, I think that you begin to see with the emergence of the papal tyranny, you inevitably invite counter-organization. And we see that particularly true with the Albigensians in southern France and so on. And we also see, I think, counter-organization taking place right under the papacy's nose when we see the rise of the military crusading orders like the Templars or the Knights Hospitallers and so on, or the Teutonic Knights. I think these are organized opposition that pretend more or less the obedience to the papacy. They're kind of, and as far as the papacy is concerned, possibly a controlled opposition. So, it's kind of another diabolical political bargain that's struck. So I think that you can date some of it to the rise of some of those types of things. But the real beginnings of those types of secret societies, I think, can be, without any question or argument from anyone on a scholarly basis, be dated to the rise of the Rosicrucian problem in the 17th century during the early Enlightenment. That's when we first get an open admission in Western society that there is a group of people that are behind the scenes. Now, whether that group actually existed or not, that's not what I'm saying. But we have the first time that this meme enters Western political, cultural thinking in a major way.
Right.
And it actually spurs people to go out and look for that society, and when they don't find it, they decide to set up what the society itself suggests. And that's when you see the rise of all the royal academies in Europe. The Royal Academy in England is started as a result of this. The various German academies and so on and so forth all come from and after the appearance of the Rosicrucian Manifesto. So speed forward a century, and by the 18th century, you do have clearly and unequivocally in the record now, you do have Blue Lodge Masonry appearing in England. If you look at the early charges of Blue Lodge Masonry, those are about a century earlier. So there was something perhaps going on Masonic-wise in response to the Rosicrucian thing a century earlier. And then, of course, by the end of the 18th century, we have Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati, who adopted the whole atheistic proto-Marxist program of the later Enlightenment, which is, that's basically nothing but what Illuminism is. So by the end of the 18th century, you see Masonry in full flower, and I would aver that Masonry is the inevitable consequence of the papal tyranny.
Right.
Because its principal target is to free people from what it regards as the papal tyranny. And they go out of their way to recruit Roman Catholics, and particularly Roman Catholics that are either in positions of academic influence or particularly in positions of artistic influence. Think of Haydn. Haydn was a Mason, and he was a devout Roman Catholic. Think of Mozart. Mozart was a Mason. So you get this desire
reaction.
you get a reaction to the papacy, and then of course you get the papal reaction to the reaction. So I don't think you can have a Masonry without the papal claims. They're kind of two sides of the same coin, as far as I'm concerned.
Sometimes these orders start and then they get diverted into something else.
Right. Sure.
So we see some evidence of that as well.
Oh, in Masonry, you betcha. Yeah, you betcha.
Yeah. They get taken over.
Well, the Bavarian Illuminati, I mean, that's their whole model. Is to use the existing Masonic orders and lodges and penetrate them, and woo certain people within those lodges, there's a lodge within the lodge, in other words, with the
Right.
Illuminati. And, this has always been kind of my problem with people that think everything's a big, dark, nasty Masonic conspiracy. I know a lot of Masons. I'm sure most everybody listening to this program can think of a couple people. And for the most part, most Masons that I've ever had any contact with, it's to them it's just kind of a social event. They don't really stop and think that the oaths that they're taking are anything serious or should be taken seriously. Now, that said, I don't think that those oaths or the rituals of even Blue Lodge Masonry are harmless. I would never myself participate in any of them, because they do contain statements and doctrines that I can't accede to. But for most Masons, I think it's kind of it's like the Oddfellows meeting on Friday nights when you play darts and drink lots of beer.
Yeah, the Moose Lodge.
The Moose Lodge. It's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That said, I do not, by the same token, rule out that there are very dark, nasty corners of the whole thing that are up to some very nasty, dark things, because you only have to study the history of it.
Yeah,
well,
that happens with the secrecy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the secrecy and so on and so forth. You
Right.
open yourself to trouble when you start doing that. And
right,
it is
and you get
true that there.
Go ahead.
It is true that there are more than just statistical coincidences of the number of people involved in intelligence that are also members of lodges. I mean,
right.
this is particularly true in Europe, and particularly it is. I know of one American, and we probably both know the name that.
Yeah, we do.
That has been in intelligence and has openly admitted to being a member of the lodge, and the two things were. In the way that he's publicly related the experience, were part and parcel of the same thing. So, it's not, to me, unusual that you have this kind of crossover. It's not unusual at all.
Yeah. But what they've done basically is that the papal tyranny created the circumstances where a reaction occurred, and then here we are a couple hundred years later, and the reaction itself may even be infiltrated, and you've got all this compartmentalization going on, where maybe even some of the members of the secret society don't even know what they're doing. They don't even know what they're really doing.
Well, as I pointed out in the appendix to Financial Vipers of Venice, I pointed out that there is a prima facie case to be made that the papacy itself, once all you have to do to understand the long-term game here is understand that once you enshrine the papal claims in the papacy, such that it can never really be itself without those claims, then in order to subvert the entire Roman Catholic Church, all you need to do is place one of your own on the papal
in the papacy.
throne.
Right.
And that, I submit, is exactly what happened with Pius IX, because he was the Pope that basically made himself infallible at the First Vatican Council. But there is a body of evidence, kind of prima facie evidence, to suggest that he himself may have been a lodge initiate.
Whoa.
And that comes from two sources. The first is the Declaration of Piccolo Tigre, which is a fairly famous 19th century Masonic declaration by a 19th century Italian Mason, that we are going to target the papacy itself and put one of our own on the papal throne. And the other bit of evidence is a book that was written by the Cardinal Archbishop of Santiago de Chile, get his name right off the top of my head, who wrote a book about lodge penetration of the church, and in that book he mentions precisely Giovanni Mistranslated as having been inducted into the lodge in Philadelphia. And of course, Giovanni Mistranslated is the secular name of Pius IX.
Wow.
Now, many people have looked at that and said, well, Pius IX, Giovanni Mistranslated, never visited Philadelphia. In other words, they're thinking that the Cardinal of Chile meant that Mistranslated journeyed to Philadelphia in the United States and was initiated into a Masonic lodge and then went back to Europe. But what they're missing, what they ignore, is the fact that when Weishaupt set up the Bavarian Illuminati, they adopted code names not only for themselves, but for the cities that they were located in. So Rome or Philadelphia or Athens and so on all became code names for particular European cities.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, if Mistranslated was inducted into a lodge in Philadelphia, that means it's very possible that he was inducted into an illuminated Masonic lodge in Europe.
Right, somewhere in Europe.
Yeah.
Maybe even Rome itself.
Maybe even Rome itself. Nobody knows. But again, these cases are what, even the traditional Roman Catholics that are, constantly appealing to Father Malachi Martin. And don't get me wrong, I knew and corresponded with Father Malachi. And he was constantly warning about Masonic infiltration of the church. And what started our conversations together was I pointed all this out about Pope Pius IX to him. And he never, in his response to that letter, he never denied nor even really responded to it specifically. He did kind of agree with the outline of my letter that in general ways, Vatican II was a direct consequence of Vatican I. Now, for a traditional Roman Catholic to admit that, that's quite something.
Wow.
Yeah,
especially
it's
someone of his stature.
Oh, absolutely. Of his stature, absolutely. And, I think probably the same holds true of many of those traditionalist people that were still left in the Roman Curia at the time, Cardinal Siri and people like that.
Yeah, so did Pope Francis come out and make a statement, or did the Curia come out and make a statement, condemning Masonry and saying nobody could be a Catholic, a Roman Catholic?
Well, I don't recall Francis as having said anything like that. It's hard to keep up what's coming out of Rome these days because no sooner does the Pope open his mouth and you've got some cardinal that's the head of some dicastery somewhere saying, no, that's not what he meant, It's becoming kind of ridiculous. But I do know that at a certain point that Paul VI revised the wording of one of the canons having to deal with Masonry in a slight way. But I don't know, I can't recall off the top of my head that any of those prohibitions have ever been rescinded.
Yeah, well, here it is from Reuters. It kind of went by, in this stream of chaos we've been living through. November 15th, 2023, from Reuters, the Vatican has confirmed a ban on Catholics becoming Freemasons. Active membership in Freemasonry by a member of the faithful is prohibited because of the irreconcilability between Catholic doctrine and Freemasonry.
Well, they're simply repeating what everybody knows, and anybody with half a brain can sit down and read Masonic rituals and compare them to Roman Catholic or Lutheran or, traditional Presbyterian or teaching or whatever and realize that they're incompatible. But the problem that I have with most of these Vatican pronouncements is there are and have been known Masons even in the College of Cardinals themselves, and they are, they're very seldom disciplined. And let me give you the most famous example that I can think of, and that's the example of Archbishop Annibale Bonini. For those Roman Catholics in the audience that are listening that are suffering through the wooden pedantry of the new Mass,
oh, God.
Yeah, well, it's pretty bad. I mean, it's just a study of labyrinthine ugliness and one-dimensionality.
There are like in my town, which is a medium-sized city of about 700,000 people, there are 7 Catholic churches that are offering one 1963 or 1962 Latin rite every week.
Well, you can't blame them, because when you try and suffer through the new mass, it's just awful. It's just ugly. It's just plain ugly.
It makes you nauseous.
It does,
Yeah.
But the new mass, the text of the new mass, the Novus Ordo Missae, was drawn up by a committee that was chaired by Archbishop Annibale Bonini.
Oh, great!
And turns out, and I forget who it was. I think it was Cardinal Ottaviani that brought evidence to Pope Paul VI that Archbishop Bonini was a Mason. So here we have, and it was confirmed. And what did Paul VI do to punish him? Well, rather than retract the new Mass, which had already been published, over Paul's imprimatur. See, here's that infallibility rearing its ugly head.
Right.
Once you're infallible, you can't change. Unless, of course, the change is against tradition, and then you can force the change because you've got that authority.
Yeah.
See, this is the whole self-contradictory mess of the whole rotten edifice. So what does Paul do? Rather than retract the new Mass and say, oops, made a mistake, which, would be the normal thing to do, it's called repentance.
You just pile on more heresies
pile on more heresy as you go. So what he did was he exiled Bonini. He didn't laicize him. He didn't strip him of his clerical rank. He didn't tell him you can't celebrate Mass anymore. What he did was he made Bonini the apostolic nuncio to Iran.
Oh my God!
So in other words, he put him into the diplomatic corps. So this is the whole problem with it. It's a case study of what's wrong with the doctrine itself.
Right.
And you can't imagine why put your arch enemy in charge of keeping the text of your most sacred ritual.
And to put it in secular terms, that's the abandonment of the rule of law in the church.
Of course it is. Yeah. And that's for, this is my problem with the papal claims themselves. It's the abandonment not only of the rule of law, but much more importantly, it's the abandonment of the norm of tradition as a doctrinal center.
Right.
If you are no longer bound by the text of your own rituals, then it's a free for all, and you're in a much worse state than anything you've ever claimed that the Protestants were doing.
Wow.
So there's a reason why there's an Orthodox fellow by the name of Alexis Khomyakov, 19th century Russian, that made the statement that the papacy is the first Protestant.
Yeah, he was.
And that's it's literally the case.
Yeah. And it's amazing. So I want to go back to one thing that keeps replaying in my mind, and that is the change to ordination, right, of bishops that happened.
Okay, the consecration bishops,
1,000 years ago or more, right? And so what happens to in Buddhism, for example, which is a religion I know very well. In Buddhism, you receive a transmission through a lama or Rinpoche, and so what it is the entry of a certain of consciousness into your mind stream, right? And but then the only way that you can manifest it after that, after that reception, is by doing the practice, right? Doing the rituals, right? And doing them properly, right? So if you've got this interruption in transmission, what has happened to the apostolic? I don't know, call energy
succession. No, it's
succession, right?
The doctrine is the apostolic succession.
Right.
Well, look, apostolic succession is the doctrine that is at the core of episcopal authority.
Right.
But it means the way it's understood in the West is usually kind of a truncated doctrine. If, for example, you are a traditionalist, Anglican or Episcopalian, what apostolic succession means is that the authority of your bishop has his office of being a bishop by dint of having been consecrated by other bishops who can trace their consecrations back ultimately to one of the apostles or apostolic men in the early church. In other words, a St. Paul or a St. Peter or a St. Timothy or somebody like that. So
right.
in other words,
who received authority.
Who received, and again, the apostles traced their succession ultimately to Christ. So in other words,
right.
apostolic succession is ultimately a part of the doctrine of the Trinity. The Father sends the Son into the world, sends the Spirit into the world. Christ, through the Spirit, sends the apostles out into the world. So the succession is quite literally, and this is why it's called the divine office, the divine apostolic office. It's literally being traced to God. It's a kind of ecclesiastical version of the divine right of kings. And again, that may seem a strange doctrine to moderns, but Christ didn't establish the Republic of God. He established the kingdom of God, So the ministry
But it's something physical. But it's something physical as well.
Right. The early church, understood the office in precisely that fashion.
Yeah.
So, the bishop is quite literally your local apostle. He's the local father of all fatherhood in the church, quite literally. So,
right.
but the succession means more than just the succession in office, and this is where it gets back to that idea of the transmission of the core doctrine of the faith.
Right.
Which means that first of all, the creed. It means secondly the text of the liturgy. The bishop is the chief liturgical steward of the church because again,
right.
the bishop possesses all ranks of ministry. In other words, when a bishop vests in the Orthodox Church, let me give you an example. The bishop vests with garments of the deacon, with the garments of the priest, and then with vestments that are peculiar to the office of the bishop. And incidentally, a Western bishop, if you look at the old Roman missals, this is exactly the way that the Western bishops were supposed to vest, because they possess all the ministries, and therefore they also are capable of celebrating or presiding over all sacraments. Okay? So they are the chief liturgical officer of the church. They are responsible for maintaining, quite literally, the text and the doctrine of the text of all of those rituals. And that means in turn that it is also a component of apostolic succession that you are the chief steward of the text and canon of the scripture itself.
Right.
So in other words, you are bound as a bishop not only to maintain the ecclesiastically agreed upon canon of the names of the books that constitute the Bible, you are also responsible for maintaining the textual tradition or readings of the microtext in those books, which would be the traditional text type. So in other words, apostolic succession is something much more than most people understand, even within the Orthodox Church, is what I'm saying.
And so does the consecrated bishop receive a slice of the authority of the Holy Spirit as well?
Well, we wouldn't put it a slice of, but yes, when any ordination occurs, it always is by invocation and understood to be the conferral of a particular grace of the Holy Spirit to perform that office and ministry. In other words,
right.
The ordination of a deacon or a priest or a bishop, if you look at the Orthodox ordinals, they preserve the ancient tradition that this must be by actual physical laying on of hands of
Right.
a bishop to that ordinand. In other words, you can't. The modern day Roman Catholic practice is the bishop sits in a chair and holds his hands out over a bunch of ordinands.
Whoa.
To us that would be, if you really want to be strictly canonical about it, that would be invalid. Number one, because there can be no multiple ordinations. There's only one candidate on one day in one church can be ordained.
Wow.
That's the canon.
So when you have go ahead.
Well, when a bishop is consecrated, it's the same thing. A bishop there should, by canonical requirement, there should be at least two co-consecrating bishops, because very early on the idea was a single consecration. You might be unsure that there was any succession that had actually been transmitted. So, in other words, very early the church abandoned the idea of a single consecration. It's two or more, so that the lines of succession would be transmitted to a bishop. If one line of succession may be invalid, this is a way of looking at it and saying, well, another line of succession would be valid. But even then, all bishops that are co-consecrating all have to lay their hands on the head of the consecrand at the same time in order to do it.
Right, but in the West they're not doing that anymore. So are they transmitting anything at all, or are they,
Well, that's the problem,
Are this the reason we have empty churches right now because the transmission has been broken?
Well, I don't know what the current Roman Catholic practice is, but I can tell you this. During I think it was the 18th or 19th century, the Church of Rome pronounced Anglican orders, the orders of the Church of England, invalid. And they did so because they maintained that the bishops being consecrated after the schism between Henry VIII and Rome were not validly consecrated. And they further made the claim that at the ordination of priests, the priests of the Church of England were not real priests nor validly ordained because the chalice was not delivered to the priest by the bishop and the priest's hands were not anointed by the bishop. Well, you can go online and read the response of the archbishops of York and Canterbury to that 19th century proclamation. I think it was Pius IX actually that made that proclamation that Anglican orders were invalid.
Always the same hands.
It was always the same hands. Well, the archbishops of Canterbury and York published what I think is a typically Anglican, brutally brilliant demolition of the whole premise on which Pius IX was arguing. And they did so by pointing out that anointing a priest with oil was not what ordained the priest, nor was it a defect in the rite. And they pointed out that the Eastern Church to this day practices the laying on of hands as the actual moment of conferring whatever order is being conferred, and that's the ancient primitive practice. And they turned the logic on its head by excommunicating and proclaiming our orders invalid on this basis. Your own orders are invalid because they're not being done according to the ancient practice.
Wow.
So, what I'm getting at is here, the argument that you're making is not the first time it's ever been made.
Right.
The Anglicans have been making this argument ever since their break with Rome, and for that matter, the Orthodox Church even longer than that. So, where are we? I don't know. The real problem now, Kelly, and since we brought up the problem, the real problem now, as I mentioned earlier, that if you look at the bishop as the chief steward of the liturgical mysteries of the church and therefore of the texts of those mysteries or the texts behind those mysteries. The office of a bishop, therefore, is literally about the transmission of the faith in its particulars. So the problem arises that we now have a whole bevy of Bibles out there that are, first of all, translations of texts that scholars think was the original text. In other words, most Bibles that you're reading are now translations of a reconstructed underlying Greek text that has been reconstructed on the basis of theories of the transmission of that text. Okay? And again, folks, I cover all of this in God, History, and Dialectic.
Well, where could that possibly go wrong?
Or where could that possibly go? Precisely. The fact of the matter is there is what is called the traditional text type, or the Textus Receptus. It's sometimes called the Byzantine text type. It's sometimes called the patriarchal text type. And that is the text type of readings of the vast, overwhelming number of manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek. Okay? In the 19th century, under the aegis of biblical criticism, a couple of scholars, they were both incidentally Anglican bishops by the name of Westcott and Hort, began to look at other manuscripts of readings of the New Testament text that were outside of the New Text of the textual New Testament Textus Receptus, and they concocted a whole theory on the basis of these manuscripts of an underlying what they thought was the original text, and they reconstructed that text and then translated it, and that became the first revised standard version of the Bible. So if you're wondering why some verses in the Old New Revised Standard read differently than the King James, it's because the underlying text is a reconstructed text. Now here's the crucial point. At the time that they came up with or concocted their theory, the manuscripts of the traditional text, of the vast number of manuscripts, dated no earlier than the year about 350 AD. So Westcott and Hort thought, and actually promulgated the idea in their theory, that the traditional text type was a late invention designed by the post-Nicene Church to foist off a text on unsuspecting believers. Okay? That's literally what they said. And this is where most of this modern nonsense was, in part, that Constantine and the bishops conspired to create books of the Bible and throw out, the whole nonsense modernist view of all of this. Here's the problem. According to their theory, there should never therefore arise any manuscript reading from a manuscript that is clearly datable to a period of time before 350 AD that contains a reading unique to the traditional text type, right? Guess what happened?
What?
Within about the last 50 years or so, I don't remember how long it's been, they actually discovered a papyrus that can be dated to the 2nd century that contains a traditional text type reading. There's your black swan.
Wow.
So the entire theory comes crumbling down. Have any of these so-called scholars bothered to modify their Bible translations? No.
No, it's the
because
Bible
they're
industrial
new.
complex.
It's the Bible industrial complex, and here's the other reason why. Those things can be copyrighted, and they can make money off of them. The King James is copyrighted, of course, under Crown copyright, but that copyright long expired.
Wow.
And that's a traditional text type.
Wow.
And here's the other problem. In the theory, you'll notice that what Westcott and Hort are after are the original autograph, and this, incidentally, is the doctrine of the inspiration of Scripture that most Protestants subscribe to, the inerrant, infallible, plenary inspiration of the original autographs. That's the doctrine. But that doctrine didn't rise until the 19th century, and it arose at Princeton University in this country.
Wow. Just like Schofield.
And and please note, I'm not done. Please note that doctrine puts you in chase of original autographs which can never be recovered other than through the critical process. What the early church was interested in were authentic copies.
Right.
And as one fellow, again, an Anglican by the name of John Bergen, he was the dean of Chichester Cathedral in England. In other words, he was the Monsignor of the cathedral. He pointed out to Westcott and Hort in a series of articles that are humorous, if nothing else, he pointed out to Westcott and Hort that the reason that you don't have many manuscripts is because the manuscripts representing the traditional text type were the manuscripts that were thumbed apart over and over again by being used in the liturgy. The manuscripts that survived precisely because they were rejected by the church and not used and read liturgically. So he points out, and that may not seem like much of an argument until he gets down to the manuscripts that Westcott and Hort do think were the manuscripts that preserved more authentic, earlier original readings. And he does so by way of a humorous illustration by saying, what should we make of 4 equivalent copies of Shakespeare? Why, some of the bard's most immortal lines would be incomprehensible. Hamlet's soliloquy might end up saying things like, to be a tub or not to be a tub. The question is that, or to beat that Toby, or to beat that Toby, or not to be a Toby.
You sound like Biden.
Yeah, precisely. And literally, he's making the humorous point. But the readings in some of the alternative manuscripts that lie at the heart of the Westcott-Hort theory are precisely that bad. That's the problem. So, folks, yes, they're barely literate. And once you really get into it, then you realize that many of those manuscripts are of Gnostic provenance and so on and so forth.
Right.
So, folks, I could go on. It's the blind leading the blind.
And making money while they're doing it.
And making money while they're doing it. Right.
That's so sinful to produce false translations based on. That's just so sinful.
There's a reason why I keep telling people if you really want a Bible that is ecclesiastically based, it's the King James, because it's the only one to use because the underlying text type is the traditional text, and number 2, the translational philosophy of it is in line with that underlying text. All others have a critical or theological, or in many cases both, agenda of some sort.
Whoa. Like Schofield.
Like Schofield, precisely. Only much more subtle. Much more subtle. Yeah.
Wow, that's unbelievable. So that leads to, the churchgoers going down blind alleys.
Well, look, in the Orthodox service of Matins, if you're in a jurisdiction that uses the Greek practice of celebrating the Matins office, on Sunday morning there will be a point during Matins at which the big gold book of the Gospels is brought out from the altar and put on a stand in the middle of the church, and people go up and they kiss the Gospel book. They venerate the Gospels, and that is the Orthodox Christian equivalent of the scrolls in a Jewish synagogue that are similarly venerated. In other words, the Gospels are considered to be the texts or books of Scripture that are at the core of the covenant. Now, what happens if you're venerating a reconstructed text on the basis of a theory that lies behind the Revised Standard Version of the Bible? Is that text worthy of your veneration, or is it painting a slightly different and ipso facto false picture of Christ other than the picture of Christ presented by the traditional text type? This is why I keep telling the Orthodox, and no one is listening to me, Kelly. No one to this day is really listening to me. But I'm going to stick with it. I keep telling those Orthodox jurisdictions that are allowing the instruction of this type of higher critical theory, and more importantly, allowing the use of of so-called Bible translations based on these theories into their liturgical worship, you are endangering your apostolic succession. I cannot be clearer or more blunt or more honest. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I just had you on mute because I didn't want to interrupt you. But so basically, this is just a whole another, vile nest of corruption.
Yes, yes, yes.
And people are putting the entire unfolding of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God under threat.
Look, this is nothing new. This business of tinkering with not only the macro canon of Scripture, throwing out this or that book that you don't like for whatever reason, but actually going in and tinkering with the minute particulate readings of Scripture, this too is nothing new. What do you think the Gnostics did? Why are there Gnostic Gospels? Why are there variant readings of the Gospels we do have? It's a part of biblical criticism when you learn biblical criticism in seminary to look at the way church fathers quoted Scripture, because oftentimes they're quoting the readings that they're familiar with. And once you get all of this massive amount of data put together, you end up with variant readings of various manuscripts, but you end up also with the vast overwhelming majority of readings fitting into the so-called traditional text. So my point is, there's nothing new here that's been going on. They simply have dusted off centuries-old techniques. This is why I keep telling people Gnosticism is a technique for the subversion of an institution. Only secondarily does it have to do with the church. You can use Gnostic techniques to impose Marxist revolutions. You can use those same techniques to take over a particular faculty in a college, and on we go.
Wow. I don't even know what to say, except that I see it everywhere. That's all
Of course
I can say.
it is. Yeah, it's everywhere.
And neurolinguistic programming is just a method under that rubric.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Of course it is.
Just like St. Augustine of Hippo's, use of Latin rhetoric.
Yeah. It's really a matter of which kind of mind manipulation do you want to subject yourself to? Do you want to subject yourself to J.S. Bach or Arnold Schoenberg?
Yeah.
Do you want to subject yourself to Dante Alighieri or to Karl Marx?
Yeah, I was explaining to my kid.
Everybody is choose your poison.
I tell my kid all the time, you got to be careful what you watch. You got to be careful what you read. And you ask yourself the question, am I willing to risk infecting myself with this?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, one final note. The interesting thing to note is that all forms of Gnosticism are ultimately parasitic.
Right. And
that's your clue.
And which is a fancy way of saying they want to take something from you.
Right.
And from the culture at large.
Yep.
And it's like that parasitic wasp that gets the worm to take care of the babies.
Yep.
Wow.
It ultimately isn't very creative.
No, it's very rigid, very insect-like, actually.
Yep, very rigid,
And
very limited. Remember in Thomas Mann's version in his novel Dr. Faustus, where he fictionalizes the life of the composer Arnold Schoenberg. There's that wonderful chapter towards the end of it where Leverkin, his fictional version of the composer Schoenberg, is confronted with Mephistopheles himself. And Mephistopheles, and I have a little, in my website webinar, I have a little excursion into Mann's depiction of what he's offering to Schoenberg. Mephistopheles tells him, I can offer you one-of-a-kind, unique, absolute originality. And it's true, he can. But once he offers it, no one else who follows that way of quote-unquote composing can ever be original. It's all mimicry. And it's all ugly.
wow.
Yeah. So
I
by
met
doing
a guy
this,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, my point is, they can't invent anything. This is why they all sound the same. This is why Joe Biden sounds no different than Professor Philostrato in C.S. Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength. They sound exactly alike. They sound exactly alike. Because ultimately, they can't be original. Why? Let's go back to nominalism. If everything is everything else and identifiable with everything else, there is no unique, real distinction. And if there's no unique, real distinction, everything is the same and everything ends up in nihilism. This is why these people always sound the same. Their whole philosophy insists that they do. This is why they always insist, like Gnostics, that you use and bow to their terminology.
Wow.
Always.
Yeah, we see that everywhere. We see that in the Democratic Party.
Yep.
We see it in some respects even in the Republican Party.
Oh, absolutely.
And, yeah. We see it in the attaching piety to the Constitution.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. People don't realize it's a contract among the states.
Yep.
Right.
And it's an adhesion contract.
Right. It's an adhesion contract. And, they said we the people in the beginning, but we the people were only, we're only just there at the beginning. The rest of it has nothing to do with the people. Right.
Has nothing to do with the people. And let's remember, I don't call it the Bill of Afterthoughts for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it didn't apply to anyone other than the states, right? And then the states, of course, their protection, their brakes on the system was to their control of the Senate.
Yep.
It was really designed for them to keep, orthodoxy, if you will, an orthodoxy of the American system in place. And then the 17th Amendment, whether it really passed or not, fired the signatories to the Constitution.
Yep. But I'm still an anti-federalist. If Adams was unable and did not have sufficient human wisdom, as that quotation from Sentinel number 1 stated, to design such three co-equals of government, how much less so did such a method apply to the doctrine of the Trinity?
Right.
So yeah, right. I'm an anti-federalist. There was no real good reason that we had to abandon the Articles of Confederation. We won that war under those articles.
Right.
What do we need this monstrosity for?
For Hamilton's empire.
For Hamilton's empire, precisely.
Yeah.
And what are we for an empire?
Yeah, I don't remember ever voting to become an empire. Do you?
No, I don't remember voting for that.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, it's been an absolutely mind-blowing discussion. I really appreciate it. So if people want to get the book, and I've read the books, I have to say, there's some of the most important reading you'll ever do. to understand the world that we are suffering through right now is to read God, history, and dialectic. Now, I want to caution people that you're going to, as Joseph has said many times in the past, you're going to have to get into the details. And we live in a culture where people just want to get the gist. And unfortunately, you can't understand the subtle corruptions in our unfolded history without getting into the actual details and differences that have compounded over time, like banking, like interest compounding over time to bring us to the current moment. So those are available on lulu.com, I understand?
Yeah, and they're on the books tab under my website as well. But yeah, you can go directly to Lulu and get them.
Okay,
but I also have
great.
to add, I have to warn people that these are difficult books. You are not going to understand what I'm saying or what we've been talking about by remaining theologically illiterate.
Yeah.
And for most people learning theology, much less learning how to think like a theologian, is very difficult.
Yeah, I went through 12 years of Catholic school, and even reading the first 100 pages of Volume 1, I learned more theology in the first 100 pages of Volume 1 than I learned in 12 years in Catholic school. Sorry.
Yeah, I can believe it. Yeah. It's so don't expect it to be easy, but it will start to become clear in Volume 2. The other thing I need to warn people about is many people write me and complain that the print in it is so tiny. There's nothing I can do about that. This is the way that the formatting worked out at Lulu. The advantage that the small print gives you is it gives you lots of room in the marginalia for notes.
Yeah.
But if you have difficulty reading the small print, I had someone tell me, "Well, I just haven't been able to finish the books because the print's so small. If you had a bigger print, I could read it." Well, buy a magnifying glass.
Yeah. Go to the drugstore.
Go to the drugstore. Get a magnifying glass. Get reading. This is an excuse. If you want to learn, it's there. And even then, I have to warn people that even with all the detail in those books, there were things I wanted to talk about that in the original class, and therefore that never made it into the books. So I simply didn't have time. So even though the books may seem horrendously detailed and so on and so forth, there is a lot of stuff that is not covered in those books that should have been by rights. I'm just too old and exhausted to try and go back and plug all that into them. So
I want to encourage people to redevelop and extend your mastery of detail, because you will be smarter when you're done with these books. You will know your history. You will know your civilization. You will know where the warts are. You will be able to recognize, the manifest heresies of our current age. You'll be able to understand why people are going off the rails. You'll be able to actually, put your lifeguard vest on and actually maybe save someone from, going off the deep end, because you will have the training, the foundation in understanding the world